next hour, we want to lean into a question that's becoming more pressing as care models evolve. What do we actually know about students who never walk into our counseling centers? And how do we gain visibility into their mental health needs? So before we go anywhere, these are the online mental health services offered through BetterMynd's platform. Our primary hosted service is 50-minute individual counseling sessions available to primarily students, but can also be provided to faculty and staff. Additionally, we offer a 24/7 crisis support line for your students, telepsychiatry, and well-being workshops through our platform. And so we are the only online therapy vendor offering well-being workshops currently. Just something for you to keep in mind. Today's conversation is grounded in the CCAPS-34, the gold standard assessment created by the University of Michigan and later donated to the Center for Collegiate Mental Health for the Development and Administration. College counseling centers across the nation are using this tool. I'll share why BetterMynd made the decision to integrate CCAPS-34 into our clinical framework and what that means for institutions looking to understand student mental health needs across the care pathways, not just within the college counseling center. This session is designed to be practical and grounded in real experience, whether you're already using the CCAPS-34, exploring how to make better use of assessment data, or thinking about what visibility across expanded care pathways would look like for your campus. Let me start with what we want you to walk away with today. So we hope you walk away with a better understanding of, and that you're able to articulate the strategic value of the CCAPS-34 as a way to measure and understand student mental health trends at your institution, understand what BetterMynd's exclusive integration means, and why having consistent assessment across your counseling center and online therapy matters for quality, continuity, and institutional insight. And then finally, connecting assessment data to decisions, whether that's informing leadership conversations, making the case for resources, or shaping your student mental health strategy. You'll hear from me on the integration of this assessment into our work, but you're also going to hear from two campus leaders on how they use mental health assessment data in practice. So you're not just getting insights from BetterMynd, you're hearing from your peers. And before I dive into the CCAPS-34 integration, I want you to know who else you'll be hearing from. It's Dr. Kim Gorman from Western Carolina University and Dr. Josh Overocker from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Each will share how they've used the CCAPS-34 to understand student mental health needs, inform decisions, and connect assessment data to institutional priorities. So welcome, Kim and Josh. So in this section, we're going to explore why and how BetterMynd is using the CCAPS, as well as give those of you who are unfamiliar with this tool a peek at the assessment and its content. So there are two versions of the CCAPS. The difference in the two is primarily related to when they're administered and which subscales are included. The CCAPS-62 is typically administered at intake and discharge in the college counseling center, and it's inclusive of a family distress subscale, which we're going to talk a little bit about subscales in a little bit, as well as a subscale that is inclusive of substance use, not just alcohol use. Excuse me. We made the decision in consultation with the Center for Collegiate Mental Health to use the CCAPS-34 for a few reasons. One, it reduces friction in the counseling process by being a bit shorter. Two, it supports repeated measurement. And three, the repeated measure is what college counseling centers are using to better understand change over time. So a little bit in terms of what's on the slide here. The 34-item clinical assessment that we call the CCAPS, the Counseling Center Assessment of Psychological Symptoms, will be administered on the BetterMynd platform for students to complete before session. The counselor has visibility into change over time through something called the profile report. It's used in hundreds and hundreds of college counseling centers across the nation. And in fact, in fairness, I should mention, is used in other locations across the world. And it is validated and reliable. So the the different areas that are explored on the CCAPS are called subscales. And so these subscales include depression, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, academic distress, eating concerns, frustration and anger, and alcohol use. Again, this is distinct from the CCAPS 62, which is inclusive of a little bit more, but this is a sufficiently useful measure that will reduce some friction for students to be able to access. And then the distress index, finally, is a simple outcome monitoring and research tool. And it's similar for those of you who might be familiar with the outcomes questionnaire 45, OQ 45. It uses items from the CCAPS 34, so there's nothing lost. The distress index is applicable. And it draws from individual items across depression, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, academic distress, and frustration, anger. Here's a snapshot similar to what a counselor would see after a student completes their assessment. While they've been reorganized by subscales for the counselor to see, these are the 34 items in which students are going to endorse on a scale of 0 to 4. So it's a 5-point Likert scale of 0 to 4, where 0 is not at all like me and 4 is very much like me. This takes students just a few minutes to complete, but it includes questions like, I am anxious that I might have a panic attack in public. Statements, and then the student will endorse from there. And so what you're seeing is, like I said, something that a counselor might see after a student completes their assessment. This is a brief and simple tool for the students to use. What you see depicted here is what our mobile interface is going to look like for a student to complete ahead of their session. They will receive the assessment within 24 hours of their scheduled session. And I'm not going to get into the security or the safety protocols associated with it just because it's not the purpose of this event, but I'm happy to respond to questions that folks might have about that after the event. And we'll have, over time, we'll have more materials coming out to our partners related to this. So the utility for the counselor, this profile report that I mentioned, this is a visual depiction of the BetterMynd counselor's view of the student's profile report. It reflects what you're looking at here, which there'll be some better views on the next couple of slides, multiple administrations of the CCAPS over a few month period. So this is called the tabular section right here. There's some graphical representation that's very specific here, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But you are seeing visual indicators of distress related to each administration of the CCAPS. So you are seeing each of the subscales that I previously mentioned, these areas, depression, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, and so on. And then here, looking at the date, you are seeing each administration of the CCAPS, typically associated with a completed appointment. And the only reason I say typically is because we know, of course, there's attendance differences that may occur, or something might get rescheduled. But a student, on this January 14th, or excuse me, January 4th, had endorsed a moderate in orange level of general anxiety, a high level of academic distress, a high level of frustration and anger. And so those are the most remarkable experiences endorsed by a student that a counselor might want to hone in on. In addition to that, there is representation of suicidal ideation and thoughts of harming others. I will just note that what we have represented up here for the purposes of this does not correspond with what you see below, but it does give a sense. This suicidal ideation graphical representation here is showing you that a student had endorsed a 0 for all of their administrations, whereas up here it's showing some varying endorsements of different scores for thoughts of harming others. Though here in our representation, you're seeing a little bit of a difference where this first administration, or this most recent, no, excuse me, the first administration is showing high endorsement of the highest endorsement of suicidal ideation and highest endorsement of thoughts. Again, thinking about protocols and around safety and some of those considerations, those are things that we are not going to get into today, but happy to answer questions ad hoc after the event, and know that, especially for our partners, we'll have more information coming out about this. So you've seen some different visual markers for counselors to recognize immediately different levels of distress associated with completion of the assessment, and then the representation of these critical items that have to do with suicidal ideation and thoughts of harming others. So these sections are the graphical representation in each subscale over time, as well as the responses to the most recently completed CCAPS-34. So again, this is similar to what our counselors will be seeing. And for those of you who are familiar, you'll see that it's consistent with the profile report that you might see in Titanium through the Center for Collegiate Mental Health. We have just, obviously some rebranded and some slightly different representations for our platform's purposes. But you will see here, this is not the graphical representation, but a graphical representation of depression for administrations over time. Those who are familiar may have some judgments about what they're seeing here. This is not very consistent with what you would see typically in a progressing CCAPS profile, but nevertheless gives you an idea of how this information is communicated to counselors. So I wanted to share why using an assessment instrument powered by the leading research center in college mental health was of importance to BetterMynd. Within the last decade, CCMH brought us the following findings. They've completed significant work, along with some others, on the development of the CLI, or the Clinical Load Index. It has implications for informing the institution's capacity to provide a certain level of intervention. 2022's annual report from CCMH found that when students experience a significant decrease in academic distress, coupled with concurrent involvement in an extracurricular activity, they were 51% less likely to withdraw from school during treatment. And then in 2025, there was evidence that financial insecurity is positively correlated with higher rates of distress. So the reason I bring that up is just to say that, of course, CCMH has some meaningful contributions to the field, but these findings are primarily coming from the data that has been contributed by participating campuses using the CCAPS. And this is some of the real value added in terms of what we want to draw from. Certainly the expertise of CCMH, but also recognizing the great insights that can be provided through the CCAPS administration. And so here you're seeing a visual that demonstrates what college counseling centers, those at least who participate in the data sharing with CCMH, have access to through that relationship. So this benchmarks against the national mean for each subscale. So again, the subscales, depression, generalized anxiety, and so on. The national comparison group, so the national mean representation on depression was pretty consistent for this college at the initial administration of the CCAPS. But the follow-up at the more likely at the end of this episode of care for this student or for the aggregation of this institution's students means that students with depression had a larger improvement as compared to the national mean. And so there's a lot of things that could mean. And oftentimes we will see something like this and it's highly correlated with the number of sessions that students might have access to in the institution. So just some things that I wanted folks to be aware of in terms of what CCMH provides in their relationship for their member campuses that are participating in the uploads and some of the insights that they can gain and be aware of from a national benchmarking standpoint. And I also should share that BetterMynd's not going to be able to compare directly to the national data, but we'll be working with our partners to find opportunities to identify meaningful connection to this through our work. So BetterMynd's plans for leveraging the CCAPS aggregate data include correlating learnings from our annual student survey data, as well as other qualitative data we receive directly from students, refining our approach to recruitment and professional development based on some of the needs that are presented or represented by the initial administration of the CCAPS for students. If we're finding, that we see really high levels of academic distress, we're probably going to do more to ensure that our counselors are prepared to support students in some of the tools or the management to attend to those concerns. And so we're really looking forward to seeing what insights we develop as a result of this. And then lastly, supporting the development of an expanded national standard of care inclusive of a teletherapy partner. Because we are the first in the field to have access to this tool, as a partner to institutions, we are really looking forward to leading the charge of external vendors to the institution in setting the standard here. So we intend to support we intend to support the institution's access to data and deepening insights about the students seeking care from their institution, not just at their institution. So institutions already know what's happening there for the most part, those who are engaged in this kind of assessment and have an understanding of who's walking through the College Counseling Center's doors. But you don't necessarily know what is happening in the resources. You don't have apples to apples comparison. And so we are looking at pulling together this data in aggregate to inform proactive strategies, guide resource planning, and strengthen the initiatives that promote student success. So in the example that's shared here, we've talked about students who struggle with disordered eating, utilizing online therapy at a much higher rate than their peers on the campus, those that are walking into the College Counseling Center. And some of the things that can come out of this is informing some upstream programming or validating added assessment related to stigma. So for students who have help-seeking behaviors on campus, if they've been deterred on campus essentially from self-disclosing eating concerns, perhaps there is something specific that the campus can do to help norm accessing their services as well, or make a conscious choice to continue to use BetterMynd in this way and have BetterMynd continue to build out our resources to support those students. So that was a little overview of the what and the why of the CCAPS-34 and our integration. But what will this actually look like in practice? So to explore that, I'm joined by two campus leaders with responsibility for student health and well-being assessment, strategy, and administration. Dr. Kim Gorman came up through the College Counseling Center leadership and now oversees And actually, I'm going to stop sharing in just a moment. But she now oversees the health and wellness at Western Carolina. She's used CCAPS as a clinician, as a director, and now is looking at this through an institutional lens. Josh Overocker led the student affairs as an assistant vice chancellor level and now focuses on well-being at University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He brings a broader institutional lens on how assessment data informs campus-wide strategies. So you're about to hear not just from BetterMynd, but from your peers on how this data is actually used. So welcome, Kim and Josh, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
All
Well, I'll
right.
speak for myself. Thanks for having me, Kate.
Okay, so I want to just note that reinforce really that Kim and Josh have come through these different pathways, and their experiences are a little different, which is really beneficial, I think, to the group that we have here. So, Kim, I'm hoping you can walk us a little bit through how you've used the CCAPS-34 to understand student mental health needs. Like, what are you paying attention to as an AVC that's different from when you were a college counseling director? What's the big picture you might be trying to understand?
Appreciate that. Well, again, thanks for having me here. I love talking about assessments, speaking to my heart. But in answer to your question, I think I'm doing some of the same things in terms of reviewing assessment as an ABC as I did as a director. But like you said, just kind of broadening out. So one of the things, I guess, just first and foremost is I'm always looking at trends. And I think that's a lot of us would say that. What do we know about what is happening? That's kind of the big question I think that I'm trying to pay attention to. But it's kind of more than like just what is happening, because I think we have to know what is happening, and then we dig into like why is it happening, and that context for the data I think is really important. That's certainly something that I've leaned into more as an AVC, because the learning the what and the why, or trying to figure that out, allows us to think through how we're going to respond on an individual basis with that individual client as well as with our community. So I think that's kind of my big picture. So I have a few more things I'll say, but I don't. I just want to pause and see if there's any clarification about that, Kate. Does that make sense?
No, that totally makes sense.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So, I'm talking about trends, and I oversee our student concern response team. So I get data in multiple ways. CCAPS is one way, but those reports that are coming to me from our faculty, our staff, and our students, that's another kind of source of data. But I see kind of my job is not just receiving that data. It really is, my job is giving information back to them so they can respond. They can help students. Kind of oftentimes it's those first responders when students are in distress. So, I think, for instance, like the social distress subscale, we've watched that kind of bounce around. And, we know it's a generational challenge for students that kind of just being in relationships and navigating relationships. But we also know with like our current socio-political context, that has impacted friendships. It's impacted parental and kind of relationships with those who are taking care of students. It impacts dating. So in discussing students' challenges, and we see that, that relational or kind of that social distress piece, I want to get in front of faculty and staff and say, this is what's happening, but let's think about why it's happening. And so giving them context so they can be empathic in their response to students who seem to be maybe, what's the word I'm looking, overreacting to situations. So I think that's kind of a part of my job. We use data for programming, and I think that's, I did that as a counseling center director, but certainly doing it more as an AVC, because I see that programming being not just the responsibility of our counseling center, but lots of departments on campus. And then I look at trends, I think, just to know how, as an AVC, how are these trends in students' needs, how are they impacting those who are providing care for those students? So our counseling center folks, our health center, want to know, like, they're managing these things by the hour. You all who are out there are managing those. So that those trends are really important for me as an AVC to think, how do I support the staff who are providing kind of just really important care um, to students. And one of the things that we've done with that is just kind of recognizing the high need of students that we see and the immense amount of trauma that our clinicians are sitting with. So we kind of had to think through systematically, and it kind of really led us to think about implementing trauma-informed care principles, not just in our counseling center, but across our university. So I think that, yeah, those are my kind of initial thoughts about how I use data, both as a director, but certainly as an ABC.
I like that you mentioned the staffing part too, because I think you've talked about it both from the lens of being humans who are all in this ecosystem together, and those that you want well enough to serve your students, as well as maybe even the implications for like professional development needs and some of those things too.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciate
And
that.
back to you had it on your slide, Kate, that piece of what those needs are in terms of the staff. Like what are the skills that for the staff that we hire to sit in front of those students? Just knowing that we need individuals who have maybe some of the skills that seem to be trending, making sure that we have the appropriate staff to help students as well.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you.
Mhm.
Josh, you have led several different student affairs units. You've had a really interesting pathway, and student life and operations involved in that as well. And so now you've moved on to well-being, inclusive of some other units. But how has your perspective on student mental health and assessment evolved through these roles? And what do you see now that you didn't see before?
I appreciate you talking about an interesting path. I'm in an interesting combination of education experiences, and so I walked through that a little bit because I think it informs some of the um, how I see things differently now. So I did my master's in counseling and worked internship in counseling centers. But in fact, my dissertation topic was about preparation of staff to deal with students with suicidal ideation. But I spent my entire professional career in auxiliaries. So I'm the person who's more comfortable talking about facilities condition index and debt service than I got CCAPS pre and post for it. So I'm not exactly sure why you invited me to be on this call, Kate, but maybe we'll get to that as we go. But I think as you think about that, certainly when I started in the work, we weren't thinking about online therapy or resources or support as a part of it. And so now thinking about assessment more broadly like, what's the total toolbox of programs and services that we provide for students, and how are we using that assessment to be able to work more closely with it? And I think that enhanced recognition, Kim, you were talking about the social anxiety, the impact of social media and technology on our students' ability to manage and coping strategies within that. Thinking about how we're prepared to intervene and support students in those situations, in addition to test anxiety or what might have been the more traditional approaches and where students came to our center, it morphs and evolves. And so how are we gathering trends and using assessment to reinforce who we're hiring, how we're training, how we're supporting who's working with students? And that's across all of them. I mean, at this point, I work with Campus Rec, our health center, and a couple other auxiliaries, and I've worked with our counseling center in the past. And, you know, in every one of those areas, how do we do well-being work broadly, counseling being a portion of that, mental health services being a portion of that, when the needs of our students are changing and the pressures from the social climate, the political climate are all morphing as well. That's where I think assessment has value, because we can't just say, well, we know that 6 years ago or 10 years ago, students were experiencing this, and that led to us doing this program, so we should always do that program. Well, students have changed. And how are we using assessment from all these multi-factored assessment tools that we have to be able to inform what students we're serving, what their needs are, and how we're performing on those needs?
Mhm. And one of the things that I had asked Josh when we had a conversation before, because he's not overseeing the college counseling center any longer. What does that mean? Because we do find a lot of silos in our institutions, and that he's still aware of the data coming out of there as the well-being leader in student affairs. So they're, working with the committees, and for those of you who know Trisha, who's the director, and is the way to obviously practically bridge and marry some of those assessments.
Absolutely. Actually asked why I ended up on the call, Kate. And then you said you looked at my bed.
Yeah, well, and that's where, I mean, I think we know that these AVP and AVC positions or executive directors, senior directors for health and well-being, because they're still on the newer end and they look so different in every institution, really better understanding what does this look like at each of your institutions, I think is a lot of value for our audience. So that's great. Kim, can you give us a specific example where the CCAPS-34 revealed something about student mental health needs that changed how you approached a problem? Maybe staffing, outreach, or a conversation with leadership?
Yeah. So we've used CCAPS as a repeat measure, and that we implemented that really early in my tenure as a director at CCAPS. And I know that can be tedious for students, and yes, a lot of complaints. But obviously we use it as a clinical tool, and I love the CCAPS for that. Just as a clinician, like sitting down with the student each and every time, going over that with them, not in great depth, but kind of acknowledging that yes, they've given us this data. Now this is what I'm seeing, and kind of let's talk about this a little bit. But looking at the overview of kind of change, the pre-post change that you talked about. One of the things we were curious about was to see when did the maximum change happen? Like when did that, as we were comparing our change pre-post, and also comparing it to the national changes, and we saw in a couple of areas we were higher than the national average at the pre-instance, and that was actually with overall distress and the suicide index. But in post, we saw that we were much below the national. I mean, very proud, and kind of the message is, we know what we're doing, like that's builds
Absolutely.
confidence, it builds trust in the community to, we can help manage kind of what students bring to us. But one of the things we were really looking is to see, because we knew we could do this work, do we have enough time? We don't have a session limit, but we in effect do because of the utilization of the service and the number of sessions that are actually available. So we were kind of curious if we could maximize that change in distress. Are we giving that opportunity for every student to actually get there? So we ran it to see kind of what our mean number of sessions were and how that matched up to where the mean session or the mean change in distress happened. And oftentimes we were behind it. That's not a surprise to any of you out there. We just don't have enough therapists to do the work. And actually that was a large part of what helped us kind of look to expand our service delivery through BetterMynd. So it was a really great way to kind of, I guess, say, we can do more. We can do more for students. Just give us the opportunity to do. Oh, yeah, thanks for the
Yeah,
help.
well, and really reinforces the benefit of being able to use assessment to support resource requests and that type of thing.
Absolutely.
One thing I was curious about when you looked at that, did it inform anything about what you do with students who present themselves later in the semester or later in the academic year when they just aren't going to necessarily have as much time?
It really, I don't know that the data did so much of that. Just from our, it's kind of more in line with our trauma-informed approach about just being honest with students. Like this is what's available. So we can do this, but we can't do this. And so it was just being upfront about that. So it was much more of a conversation than kind of a data collection piece.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you. Okay, so for each of you, and Josh, if you want to start, as care expands beyond the counseling center, so inclusive of online therapy, what does it mean to have, how do you make use of this consistent assessment data across the pathways? How is that different? And what visibility would that potentially support?
Sorry, my mouse got lost and I couldn't find the unmute. I mean, I think actually maybe part of the answer to that, Kate, is how it's not different. I think the
Mm.
idea of bringing CCAPS through our online services to map the experience for our students in the different delivery methods through the same tool, to me is really where the value is. I mean, I can't tell you, you mentioned Trisha, our director. Trisha's ecstatic about academic distress as as a data point for us, and thinking about our students who opt for BetterMynd and use the BetterMynd services. We have data about their demographic. We have some self, but now being able to use the same tool to say, do we see a disproportionate use of BetterMynd for an academic distress sub inventory or subscale than we do in our in-person sessions? And what does that mean? And thinking about, we've expanded with embedded services into our colleges. And so the ability now to be able to look at subscale reports by demographic information to be able to help inform what our embedded services is in the College of Engineering, which might be different than our College of Fine and Performing Arts, that has real value. And we're able to now capture that through the online tool that we're doing, not simply the in-person. So we've been using CCAPS in person for a while. Our counseling team presents each year at our annual assessment summit to talk about the performance of, who they're seeing, what cases they're seeing, trends, data, and outcomes, so that we're all aware of it and understanding that. But I think the idea for it to really, from a well-being point of view, for us to really think about what programs and services we're offering that directly impact our students, and that we have the ability to morph a little based on the space we're walking into.
Yeah, well, and actually, I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things, just for those who do not work with BetterMynd, for you to understand, is that when students work with the platform, they can indicate that they have presenting concerns. And so academic concerns is one of them. And so it sounds like Trisha's already seen at UNL that BetterMynd presenting students are showing a really high endorsement of having an academic concern. Now, with the CCAPS data, you're going to be able to see to what degree,
Right.
compared to your students in person. So I want to make sure that distinction folks are aware of. So I really appreciate you bringing that one up. That's great.
I think it allows for better consistency around our storytelling too. Trisha refers to the BetterMynd as a tool in our toolbox. How do we expand group and in-person and individual and now online to be able to meet all of our students' needs? There's no one that does everything, but to have consistent assessment across all of those tools, so that our consistent storytelling about reach and impact, now we're speaking the same language become all the different methods and services we're using.
Yeah, and I think, it's interesting because the story is going to be a little different. At least the segment of the story that you're telling is going to look a little different depending on who your audience is. So within the College Counseling Center, really the comparison and the distinction between the online BetterMynd served group versus the College Counseling Center group is probably a little bit more of what's important. But I think what you're getting to at the institutional level, the narrative of all of our help-seeking students that we are sponsoring services for, this is what we know. And yeah, that's a lot of what I'm really excited about. So, and then Kim, for you, this whole idea, what will this look like? What do you anticipate this looks like for Western Carolina?
Yeah, I'm very curious to see, because to the point of the title of this particular webinar is, the students that are walking through, we don't know. We don't have the information. And so it's really, I guess exciting is the word, to know that we have a chance to kind of capture some information. We'll start there, help-seeking students. And we, of course, don't know how that might represent those who are not help-seeking, but that starting that comparison, like you all were just talking about, is a huge kind of first step to see what are we missing. Because we miss. And so that will really, I think, can be important for us to review, to consider. I think about on a programming stance, kind of with a wide reach, or just what messaging do we give out, not just to the students, but to faculty and staff who are working with those students, about what we have been missing. And so I think it offers a lot of opportunity just to support students in ways that we just haven't been aware of the need. Well, we've probably been aware of the need, but now we have the data to back up. Like we gotta push this forward.
Yeah. And it is amazing how many of us kind of get pigeonholed into using anecdotal information to support our storytelling and now really hoping that we're going to be able to contribute to the institution or at least the folks who are pulling this together for the institution to give you a little bit more complete of a picture. So that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, so Josh, for student affairs or well-being leaders who want to use assessment to understand student mental health needs, but don't have direct experience or as much visibility into the college counseling center operation, how would one go about bridging some of those gaps?
As I thought about this, Kate, counseling centers are scary. If you didn't come up through it, you throw up words about confidentiality and the intensity of that are there. If you haven't had experience in counseling, that it's off-putting at times for folks in administrative roles to feel comfortable reaching out and saying, help me understand. And so I say that to say, I think putting that aside and saying, really, at the end of the day, it's just like everything else we do. It's about building relationships. So the best success I've had with, working with Tricia has been, like, what challenges are you facing? What are you seeing? How are we working together to accomplish those? And so I think part of my message is put aside the part that you don't understand. When can I release information? What are these pieces on it? Harm to self, harm to others? What are my criteria for breaching confidentiality that you may not know? And just say, you're a person who's here to help support students. We have a shared mission. How do we understand that, reach out, connect, and engage fully? It's as simple as that, Kate, is that at the end of the day, that then we're able to share what assessment data means or is important, and counseling leaders are able to talk about, these are what we're seeing in trends and how does that relate to what we're seeing in participation in recreation services or caseloads in health center. Now we have those shared experiences or shared metrics that we're able to talk about. But if we don't start with the relationship, then you get turned off by the jargon, by the technicality. I think moving past that and engaging, maybe that's because I have a master's in counseling. It starts with rapport first, but that's
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you also point to this idea of where is there an opportunity for some common language and reinforcing the common goal. And I think, I think it's a fair point because I do think at least at a lot of institutions, there's a lot of mystique, so to speak, around the College Counseling Center. And each one operates differently on different campuses in terms of what that looks like within the campus culture. But yeah, the confidentiality piece is pretty unique to these units. So yeah,
I would say if we can figure out how to simplify having that balance of enough individualized information to tie it to our campus retention metrics, that will be, that when you go to confidentiality, that's always our engagement and success area is looking at how do we talk about retention, and they want to pull it into their Tableau dashboard, and we can't, that's a bridge we can't cross. That I do think that's a part that we'll always have to work through, but you start with an understanding to be able to do that.
Yeah, for sure. I know. Yeah, a lot of challenges with those things. Although I think there are some places that have figured some of them out too. So getting practical, a lot of leaders know that they should be using assessment or expanding their use of assessment to understand student mental health needs and connecting this with retention, persistence, and student success, but they just don't necessarily know how. It feels really big. You even think about the stuff specific to student well-being that you have access to, and there's NERSA related surveys. You've got the National College Health Assessment. You have the Healthy Mind Study. Right? We there's so much out there. So you've got the stuff that's happening at the service level, and then you have the population level surveying that's happening. You're trying to bring all of this together. It's a lot. So it's overwhelming. A whole lot of pieces to it. So starting with you, Kim, what student success insights have you gained from your use of the CCAPS data? But most importantly, which ones have resonated most with like college executives? You know, a lot of the folks that you really need to translate the story for or translate the data for.
Yeah, the one has been what I talked about earlier, the change in the suicide index, because sadly, that's I mean, of course, we're concerned about suicidality, but that's the term that, to your point, Josh, there's some kind of terms at the executive level that really kind of catch ears. So for us to show, like, please help students kind of navigate to therapy, especially kind of through us, so that we can assist them. And, before it might have been, do we need to call, faculty would be like, do I need to call police? The student just told me that they're experiencing suicide. Now, we've kind of triggered this whole kind of campus-wide response, and we've been really effective at saying, you don't have to call anybody else except CAPS, because we can, please bring them here. And the university has shifted in saying, you know what, if they're at CAPS, we don't need to do any kind of threat assessment kind of thing. They are doing the work that needs to be done to ensure the student safety. So that has been, I think, kind of the key piece that I have seen in my tenure here to shift.
That's awesome. So you've really used this data to reinforce trust, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely.
You know,
Yeah.
we're doing what we say we do, and here's the proof.
Exactly.
That's awesome. Okay, that's great. And Josh, similarly, how do you connect this student mental health picture on your campus to these broader conversations about student success, retention, and persistence?
Absolutely. I guess I would frame it in what I view as good news is we don't have to convince campus leadership that there are mental health concerns, that our students are facing mental health concerns. Maybe sometimes we have to ratchet back that this isn't a crisis that's disproportionate the rest of their demographic age for our traditionally, age students. And so there is a portion of, oh my gosh, what is I going to do? The sky is falling. We have a problem. We have to fix this problem. That exists, and maybe we have to kind of get them to temper that a bit to think about the systematic approach. And I don't think we have to convince our campus that retention matters. The conversation about the demographic cliff, certainly has been on many campuses and in professional areas. And what's it going to do when we're tuition dependent institutions and we're losing, students, and how do we manage that? So I think the opportunity continues to be to tie how what we do helps with retention. And I would like maybe take a little liberty and say, I think this is true across all well-being services, that what are those areas where the work we do, the upstream preventive work, the support work that happens, helps our students have access to services that ultimately helps them be retained by the institution and then graduate. And when we tell that story, we get significant buy-in on it. I'm not saying that's easy. As you said, there are some institutions that can do that well. There are some that are challenged with it. But broadly, I would say I don't think we have to ring the bell and say, hey, look over here, we have a problem. Most campuses are like, oh, mental health among college students, we should talk about that. And most campuses are, oh, retention, we should talk about that. We need to connect the dot.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's not always clean and neat to bring things under the same umbrella, but being able to at least rely on the vendor partners that you're working with to extend your services, having some apples to apples data that you can integrate into that story, I think will benefit folks a fair bit because it's a lot to navigate.
Because I think it's hard when, as you said, when you train leadership on certain metrics or certain things to then have to shift and say, well, for this service level, we're looking here, but when you're here, you have to think about this one. Then we lose some power on it. And so when you get buy-in, Kim, to your point about the suicide index, like when I get buy-in on a particular metric or flag, to be able to reinforce that through all of our processes, rather than having to go up into the chancellor's office and say, okay, when we're talking about in-person and CCAPS, think about this. But I'm talking about online, think about this. That's where I think some of us are harder to train than others. So once you get us trained, you don't want to have to change terms.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I absolutely. And also it's just, we know too that even staff and faculty retention has changed a lot over the last decade, at least the last decade. So having historical perspective and institutional knowledge transferred between folks is difficult. So being able to use the same language consistently across is, further beneficial. Awesome. Thank you both for this. I feel very confident that you being able to provide kind of like your real life use and your strategy and approach in this is meaningful to our audience today.
Okay, as you move forward to the next thing, we do have a question that
Yeah,
came in the chat,
great.
and it's from Amy, and they asked, can you speak to how you chose to administer the CCAPS-34 rather than the CCAPS screen?
Oh, yeah. So, because our counselors are using it as part of their clinical assessment moving forward, we decided not to use we didn't really entertain the screening tool because we wanted it to be clinical assessment, and not simply a screen. Obviously, we know that the screen has, wide implications, and it's great because you can use it at the population level, but because we're using it to inform a lot of the intervention, or at least contribute and supplement the clinician's clinical interview assessment of the student. We wanted the application to be clinically specific, so that's a big piece of it. Thank you for that question. I haven't gotten that one yet, so that's good. So talking a little bit about what lies ahead. So we are going to talk about what you can expect for this new integration with BetterMynd. In this spring, so in the next month, we are going to convene our early adopters cohort. So we've been really fortunate to have a lot of interest from our current partners in this. And so we will be working with a number of institutions. And if you haven't heard from us yet, don't worry, we're finalizing just some of our documentation associated with this, but to bring together a learning community. So folks, the early adopter institutions, we're requiring them to be CCAPS members, CCMH members using the CCAPS, so that we have the benefit of some apples to apples comparisons that we can start to do, but really be able to benefit from their feedback, and their experience and taking a look at supporting our product direction for the reporting dashboard that we will be setting up in the BetterMynd platform. Excuse me. And then in the fall of 26, when this is released to all students on the BetterMynd platform, our first milestone will be visibility into subscale acuity. So this idea of the mean score or the level of distress experienced by students at the first administration. I think this is where we're going to see the most meat in terms of the meaningfulness of this, and I think it's just gonna offer a lot of opportunities. But future milestones include things like this subscale acuity change across the episode of care. So to what degree academic distress is one that I'm like particularly interested in, making sure that our counselors who are not working, well, some of them are, but generally speaking are not working in the college, at a college campus, do they have enough tools in their toolbox to support students with reducing the distress associated in that academic distress subscale. So we're looking forward to learning more alongside with our partners.